I'm here with Professor Steve Casey from the LSE. Steve, what do you consider diplomacy to be?
Well, I think in the most simple terms it is simply the effort by two or more states to sort of reach agreements on areas of conflict through negotiation and bargaining. I think in the American context it often is heavily focused on this idea of bargaining, but also as well the way I've encountered it in my own research on the 1940s and 1950s is I think in sort of three ways. The first way is very much through summit diplomacy, so looking at the interactions between the leaders at the very top, the Roosevelts and Churchills, Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin, so Tehran, Yalta, these conferences. The second way, which increasingly I've looked at it as well because I've focused more and more on military history, is actually when the military get involved in diplomacy, as they did in the Korean War, the last 2 years of the Korean War, truce talks there, and looking at the types of problems that when not the State Department, not the normal civilian officials get involved, or what the military brings or doesn't bring to the whole process of diplomacy. And then thirdly as well, for me, increasingly the focus has always been on the public side of diplomacy. I think we look now very much at summits and the constant summits that we now see between political leaders as big news events and symbolic moments. But I think that's always been there. It was always there, for instance, right from the start. But it was there in 1940 with the Wells Mission, which you know a lot about. There was clearly an important symbolic element behind that. So looking at how this diplomacy plays out in the public sphere, when the press is allowed in, the conditions under which these diplomatic interactions are reported, I think is an important element. And it also feeds into some of the other problems that some diplomats have, be they either civil or military, when they are trying to interact with other diplomats from other countries.
Great, thanks, Steve. Just to pick up on one point there, and given your expertise in that relationship between diplomats undertaking diplomacy and military officers undertaking diplomacy, what do you see as the sort of main challenges in furthering that relationship?
Well, I think particularly, it wasn't unique to the Korean War, because of course there was also a process throughout the Vietnam War as well where something similar happened, but this whole idea of talking or negotiating while fighting raises a whole series of very interesting problems. So actually the diplomatic interactions between the military in the Korean War, between largely the American military and the Chinese military, they were actually also at that very same moment in time fighting a war. So the extent to which this was diplomacy, and I think it was because there was some effort to try and reach agreement so the guns would fall silent, but also that was bound up very much with the way in which the military were then trying to fight the war. So for instance, launching operations in order to exert leverage at the diplomatic bargaining table. And also finally as well, because there's an ongoing, not just the military struggle in Korea, but also a more general Cold War struggle going on, these so-called diplomatic interactions also became very much bound up with propaganda. So both sides were making sort of points as well. And I think the fundamental element here was just how much more difficult it was for the military on either side to reach agreement. Now I think it was bound up with some of these problems that I've discussed, but I think it's also bound up for sort of these characters just weren't trained in this. Rosemary Foote argues, I think very well in her book on the Korean War Armistice, A Substitute for Victory, that actually the military mind and the whole military upbringing just isn't really prepared for sort of the give and take. It's very much sort of what can we coerce these others into doing, rather than where we might see a sort of traditional sort of suave diplomat basically playing a sort of perhaps more subtle game.
Okay, great. In terms of your experience and the research you've undertaken, how do you know when diplomacy's gone well? What are the measures of success in diplomacy?
I think for an historian that's particularly difficult because I think it relates to obviously the timing afterwards. So I think, for instance, a great example of this, of course, is the Yalta Conference. Roosevelt comes back from Yalta in early 1945. It's a major success, and actually in Roosevelt's own terms, and I think those around him, it was a major success because they had a very real goal, and that was to bring the Soviet Union into the war against Japan, and that was a key goal at that moment in time. The atomic bomb hadn't yet been tested, and so that was a key goal. So it was viewed, I think, publicly as a major success, but it's also viewed as a success because of the way in which the leaders defined their own objectives. Now, you take a different vantage point a year or two, 5 years later. And of course it looks very, very different. So, and you could say that with lots of these sort of big summits, even summits where perhaps less controversial than that. It really depends pretty much on your point of view in time. Helsinki in 1974 is another good example. To what extent were the Americans really that interested in an outcome that might have actually helped to undermine the Soviet rule in Eastern Europe, which was part of the claim that was made sort of 15 or so years later. At the time, they were viewing it very differently. So trying to, I think, two ways, obviously, is trying to sort of establish as you can with the primary records as an historian, what were the leaders' objectives going in and to what extent do they achieve them in the short term. But then secondly, saying how much can we read into this particular moment in time from a later vantage point. It's very easy to read back a lot into it. So I would sort of take very much what the leaders are trying to achieve and very much a sort of short term, is it actually achieved them? Because things look very different sort of 10, 15 years later, and I think it's very easy to sort of read too much back into sort of success or failure.
Okay. In identifying those those measures of success in diplomacy, how do we know when diplomacy has failed? What are the sort of benchmarks in that regard?
Well, again, it is, and I think trying to establish what the desired outcome is to begin with. Another perhaps way of trying to view this is what, and I'm viewing it very much through the lens of, say, summit diplomacy or the truce talks that I've discussed before. What one obvious starting point, and this is where it does get involved very quickly in politics, to what extent is this a bargaining process, and to what extent have the various governments got clear sort of red lines, fallback positions, what's acceptable, and how much of that do they actually achieve, is the obvious way as an historian of trying to establish that, particularly as we are often, through the basis of sources becoming available, we are able to establish what their position was going into this. So I think that's one obvious way. But diplomacy isn't always about this bargaining give and take. I would actually view Roosevelt, somebody that we both worked on, as somebody who actually was less interested in necessarily haggling over particular details, more interested in establishing a relationship, particularly a relationship with Stalin throughout the war, which he would hope would be the sort of centre point of his post-war strategy. So one obvious way is not simply sort of saying, okay, this particular set of leaders before they went into this process wanted X, Y and Z, and they only got X and Z, so it was only partly success. But actually I think diplomacy is more than about that. It's often about sort of, particularly when you're dealing with allies, it's also often about trying to sort of construct a relationship, trying to begin a process. So it might be a sort of series of moments in time. And I think that's much more difficult to establish whether that succeeds or fails. Of course, in the instance of World War II, there is a spectacular failure when it comes to American-Soviet relations because, of course, the Cold War, rather than a close relationship between the Americans and Soviets, break that. But was that a failure of Roosevelt's diplomacy? Was that just simply a function of Roosevelt dying before the war comes to an end? These things are very difficult to judge. But I think trying to sort of establish what the goals are, I think, is just the obvious prerequisite.
Okay. Well, I'm inclined to agree, but I think that's a very valid point there. In terms of your sort of individual experience of life and watching the world go by, as it were, where else do you see diplomacy at work? Where else does diplomacy happen, other than perhaps in our mutual interest in the 1940s? Yeah,
sort of. Well, I think one of the things that you could easily say, or one of the things that's clearly happened actually, and I think one of the reasons why I think the 1940s is an interesting starting place, is because this era of summitry begins now with the growth in particularly sort of transportation. Of course, you see a thickening of that going on through the Cold War era and beyond, and also an institutionalisation of that process as well. So not only did the post-war era see these institutions, NATO, the European Union and so on, G7, grow up, but they also became a forum for very much established, regular, routine interactions. And if we go all the way back to sort of Roosevelt's view of sort of a four policemen, sort of trying to formalise relations between allied actors, And perhaps what we've seen over the past 60, 70 years is a thickening of that, and it's become very much an established part of all leaders' mode of operation. The President of the United States will spend X number of days and weeks of the year outside of Washington, just engaged in these very much formulaic often meetings on a whole host of areas, not just hard security issues as there were in the 1940s, but increasingly economic and obviously environmental as we're seeing now. So I think what we've seen in the period since we've both focused on it is just a thickening institutionalisation, and I suppose also a bureaucratisation of the whole process. So I think what we also would need to think about now is not simply to what extent is any business now done very much between heads of states, or to what extent has actually this all been bureaucratised, and has the actual sort of summit become more the symbolic moment rather than a moment when real negotiations is taking place. So has diplomacy sort of become a more sort of day-to-day function of the bureaucracies beneath the very top leaders is, I think, an interesting case in point. These are no longer the exceptions, these are the norms.
Okay. And in terms of the work you've done, and indeed, again, perhaps more general observations if they apply, who do you identify as a very good diplomat? What are the key characteristics of a good diplomat that you can see in particular individuals?
That is a very, very tough one, because I think it's easier probably to look at what a bad diplomat is actually as well. And one of my PhD students has recently published a book looking at, well, one of the major focal points is Jimmy Carter. And I think Jimmy Carter is an interesting case in point, because I think he had many of the attributes that we might want in a very good diplomat, and he focused heavily on the Camp David agreements. Now Carter very much micromanaged that and got very much involved in the real nitty-gritty details of that particular diplomatic process, with very real short-term successes. But I think they came at such huge political cost for his administration and the Democratic Party more generally, that it was very hard to see what ostensibly looked like a major achievement in 1978. It was very hard to see that as ultimately a success. So I think what a very good diplomat at the very top levels, which is where I've focused most of my work and my thinking, I think what there also needs to be is an element of detachment from the whole process as well. So there needs to be a balance between knowing when to get involved and when to sort of step back, knowing when, and that's where I think the politics of it comes in as well, knowing how to sort of portray this, so it ultimately the achievements then become perceived to be achievements, that they're not constantly becoming a sort of political football. So I think those skills, which are, I think, very, very difficult, sort of knowing the right balance. And I think the other major difficulty, of course, that you have in trying to sort of really establish who is a good and who is a bad diplomat is looking at the underlying realities behind the process as well. There clearly are occasions when it's just easier for leaders to come to agreement. So if you can contrast Carter, and I would say sort of who had the weaknesses of his strengths almost, if you can contrast Carter with Reagan in the 1980s, now it's very easy to come up with a glib assumption that Reagan was the opposite. He wasn't a details person, he was very successful. But was he successful because he was a great diplomat and he had some very good people around him, or was he simply successful because of what the chaos that was beginning to unfold in the Soviet Union? And so again, going back to sort of the measures of success and failure and what is good, what is bad, I think it's hard to come up with any hard and fast rules. But my own starting point is really this knowing when to get involved and when to step back, when to basically, or how to basically also sell this as a package domestically. We're looking at the moment with Cameron engaged in a number of diplomatic arrangements or interactions with his European partners. Now, that process will in large part be, or the success or failure of that will in large part be governed by what the outcome is then subsequently domestically, very, very obviously in the referendum. So not only is it Cameron's ability to deal with his European partners, but it's also his ability then to come back and create a domestic constituency, and those two things going together, I think, are a crucial way of ascertaining whether someone's a good or a bad diplomat.
Okay, great, Steve. Thank you very much.
Okay.